And just when I thought I had seen it all, one town caught me completely off guard. There were empty streets, but I could hear whispers, like fragments of old conversations carried by the wind. An abandoned school stood at the edge, and I could almost feel someone watching, though no one was there. Locals told me stories of sudden disappearances decades ago, of lights flickering in houses that had long been empty. Walking through this quiet place, my heart raced, and I realized these towns hide secrets that textbooks never mention. What I saw made me question, what is real, and what do we only believe? If you love uncovering hidden stories and exploring places few have seen, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. 1 Princeville, North Carolina, USA. I still remember the silence when I first arrived in Princeville, North Carolina, USA. It was not the peaceful kind of silence you find in tourist towns. It felt heavier, like the town was holding its breath. As I walked down the quiet streets, I could feel that this place had seen more than most small towns in America. Princeville is known as the first town in the United States founded by formerly enslaved African Americans. Knowing this made every step feel important. I stood near old homes and empty lots, imagining the courage it took for people to build a town here after slavery ended. This was not just land. This was proof of survival. But Princeville's story did not stop in the past. While talking to locals, one thing kept coming up again and again: floods. The Tar River flows nearby, and in 1999, Hurricane Floyd changed everything. As I listened, I could almost see it. Water rising fast, streets disappearing, families leaving with whatever they could carry. Many never came back. Walking through the town, I noticed homes raised on tall foundations. Some buildings looked newer, others abandoned. It felt like Princeville was caught between rebuilding and letting go. A local man told me he rebuilt his house twice. His voice was calm, but his eyes told a different story. He said the floods return, not always loudly, but always with a warning that this town is fragile. In 2016, Hurricane Matthew flooded Princeville again. Standing there, I felt the weight of that reality. Imagine rebuilding your life, only to watch the water take it away once more. That thought stayed with me. It was not unbelievable because it was dramatic. It was unbelievable because people stayed anyway. As I walked near the town hall, I felt a strange mix of sadness and respect. Princeville is small, and many businesses are gone, but the identity of the town is still alive. You can feel it in the way people talk about their history, not as victims, but as survivors. When I finally left Princeville, I did not feel like I had visited a forgotten town. I felt like I had witnessed a quiet fight. A town that refuses to disappear, even when nature and time push against it. Princeville, North Carolina, USA is not just a place on a map. It is a reminder that some stories are real not because they shock you, but because they stay with you long after you leave. 2 Aurora, North Carolina, USA. I reached Aurora, North Carolina, USA on a quiet afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was how still everything felt. The road into town was long and empty, with trees on both sides and almost no traffic. It felt like I was slowly leaving the modern world behind. When I finally saw the sign for Aurora, it did not feel like an arrival. It felt like stepping into a place that time had decided to slow down. Aurora is small, but it carries a heavy past. As I walked near the edge of town, I could see the land stretching wide and flat. This was once the heart of one of the largest phosphate mining operations in the country. Locals told me how, for years, the mine gave people jobs, stability, and a reason to stay. Families grew here because the mine promised a future. Standing there, it was hard to imagine how busy this town once was. Schools were fuller, shops stayed open longer, and people believed Aurora would always survive. Then, slowly, things changed. The mine reduced operations, and many jobs disappeared. People began leaving, not all at once, but one family at a time. Each goodbye quietly made the town smaller. I walked past houses that looked well cared for, sitting next to others that felt empty. It was strange how close life and loss lived together here. I spoke to an older resident who had worked at the mine for decades. He did not sound angry. He sounded tired. He said Aurora did not collapse overnight. It faded. And fading, he said, is sometimes harder to accept. As I moved closer to the Pamlico River, the air felt different. The water was calm, almost peaceful, but it carried its own reminder. Storms and rising waters have always threatened this area. Locals know that nature here is beautiful, but it never fully relaxes. I stood there thinking about how this town had faced both economic decline and environmental pressure, yet still existed. What stayed with me the most was the feeling that Aurora had not given up. There were signs of community pride everywhere. A small museum, a few open shops, and people who still greeted each other by name. It did not feel like a ghost town. It felt like a town holding on, quietly and stubbornly. When I left Aurora, North Carolina, USA, I felt something unexpected. Not sadness, but respect. This town did not try to impress anyone. It simply stood there, shaped by industry, loss, and resilience. Aurora's story is real because it is not loud. It is the kind of story you only understand when you stand there yourself and feel how much has been taken, and how much still remains. 3 Scotland Neck, North Carolina, USA. I remember turning onto the main street of Scotland Neck, North Carolina, USA, and feeling an immediate sense of stillness. It wasn't the calm of a peaceful morning. It was the quiet of a town that had once hummed with life but had slowed over the years. The streets were clean, but the few cars I saw were old, and the occasional passerby nodded as if reminding me that life here moved differently. Scotland Neck is small, but it has always carried its own identity. Walking past the old textile mill on the edge of town, I imagined the sound of looms running, the smell of fabric dye, and the chatter of workers who made this place lively. The mill was closed now, windows boarded up, and the chimney stood tall as a lonely reminder of what used to be. Locals told me that the mill once gave the town its pulse. Families depended on it for generations. When it shut down, life here didn't end overnight, it faded, quietly, in layers. I spoke to a man sitting outside a corner store. His hands were calloused from farm work, and he wore a hat that had clearly seen better days. He told me stories of growing up in Scotland Neck, of baseball games on the empty lot behind his house, of dances in the old community hall. He laughed softly when he mentioned how he and his friends used to race bicycles down the street. But his eyes told me another story, one of watching neighbors leave one by one, children moving away for opportunities that the town could no longer provide. As I wandered further, I noticed the way the town seemed to hold memories in every corner. An old school building, now silent, had chalkboards still faintly marked with lessons from years ago. A small diner, barely open, had a single bell that rang when customers entered, echoing like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Even the trees along the street seemed to lean toward each other, sharing whispers of the past. It felt like I could sense the lives that had moved through this town, the joys and disappointments layering the air itself. By the time I reached the river that skirts the town, the sky was soft with sunset. The water reflected colors that made everything feel both real and timeless. I could see why people stayed here despite the hardships. The land had a quiet beauty that reminded you life wasn't only about progress. It was about roots, history, and memories that could not be erased. Scotland Neck had lost its industries, but it hadn't lost its soul. When I finally left, I realized something important. This town is not empty. It is alive in a subtle, almost secret way. The stories of Scotland Neck, North Carolina, USA are not the kind you hear on the news or read in history books. They are the stories you feel when you walk its streets, meet its people, and notice how life lingers in every brick, every tree, and every quiet corner. It is a town shaped by survival, resilience, and the simple courage of staying, even when the world moves on. For Garysburg, North Carolina, USA. I first saw Gettysburg, North Carolina, USA on a bright morning, and the quiet of the town struck me immediately. It wasn't empty in the ghost town way, it was alive in the soft, patient rhythm of small town life. People walked slowly, exchanged greetings, and the smell of fresh earth mixed with faint traces of old industry. It felt like the town itself had learned to slow down, as if it knew better than to rush. Walking through the streets, I noticed houses that had clearly been lived in for decades. Some were freshly painted, while others had peeling siding that told stories of harsh winters and relentless sun. I imagined the families who had built their lives here, relying on the town's connection to the railway and the nearby farmland. Gettysburg had once been a hub of movement, a place where trains carried goods and hopes alike. But today, the railway lines were quieter, and fewer goods passed through. Life had slowed, but it had not stopped. I met an older man outside a small grocery store. He had worked on the railway most of his life, and his hands were lined with years of labor. He told me about how the town used to hum with activity, how every train that came through felt like the heartbeat of the community. Now, he said, the trains come less often, the mills have closed, and many young people have moved away for better opportunities. He smiled softly, but there was a shadow in his eyes, part pride, part sorrow. As I walked further, I noticed how the land itself seemed to cradle the town. The field stretched beyond the horizon, dotted with crops and old farmhouses. I could hear birds and the occasional bark of a dog, sounds that reminded me life was still present here, even if it was quieter than before. The slower pace allowed moments to sink in, the way neighbors paused to chat, the way children ran along the empty streets, their laughter echoing like a promise that life would continue. By the riverbank at the edge of town, I felt a strange sense of calm mixed with respect. Gettysburg had faced challenges, declining industry, families moving away, and the constant pressure of a modernizing world, but it had endured. The people here did not pretend the town was bigger or richer than it was. Instead, they embraced what remained, holding on to community, history, and resilience. Leaving Gettysburg, I realized that small towns like this have a quiet strength. They teach patience, endurance, and the importance of remembering where you come from. Gettysburg, North Carolina, USA, is not flashy, and it does not demand attention, but standing there, I felt the weight and beauty of lives lived with care, the echoes of a community that refuses to disappear. It is a town shaped by survival, memory, and the simple act of staying, even when change whispers from every direction. 5 Bath, North Carolina, USA. The first time I arrived in Bath, North Carolina, USA, I felt as if I had stepped back into history. The town is quiet, almost untouched, with streets lined by old buildings that have seen centuries pass. There is a weight to the air here, a sense that this place remembers everything, people, celebrations, struggles, and the slow passage of time. It's not the kind of quiet that makes you sleepy. It's the kind that makes you notice every small sound. The wind brushing against shutters, footsteps on wooden porches, and the distant call of a river bird. Bath is the oldest town in North Carolina, founded in 1705. Standing there, I imagined the first settlers walking along the banks of the Pamlico River, carving out a life in what must have felt like the edge of the world. Walking down the streets, I could see faded markers of history. Colonial-style homes, a small cemetery with names that go back hundreds of years, and the old courthouse that had once been the heart of the town. Each building seemed to whisper stories if you paused and listened. I met an elderly woman sitting on her porch, knitting quietly as she watched the world move past. She told me about the pirates, including the infamous Blackbeard, who once sailed these waters. She spoke with a calm authority, as if the stories had been passed down through generations and were now part of the town's very soul. I could almost picture the excitement and fear of those early days, the clash of adventure, commerce, and danger, all flowing along the same river that now reflected the orange glow of the late afternoon sun. As I wandered further, I noticed that Bath is more than just history. There is a rhythm to life here, even if it moves slowly. Small shops still open their doors, families tend their yards with pride, and children's laughter occasionally breaks the quiet like a promise that life continues. But there is also a bittersweet awareness that some things have passed. Businesses that once thrived along the riverfront have closed, and younger generations often leave for cities with more opportunity. The town feels like it exists in two worlds at once, past and present, memory and living reality. When I sat by the riverbank, I felt an almost sacred quiet. Bath is small, yes, but it holds a unique sense of identity. The town doesn't shout for attention. Instead, it holds its history, its people, and its resilience close, quietly reminding anyone who visits that survival is not always about growth or noise, it's about staying true to who you are. The river flows steadily, just as life flows steadily here, carrying centuries of stories with it. Leaving Bath, I realized the town had left something with me. It was not just a history lesson. It was a feeling. A deep respect for a place that has endured storms, pirates, and the passing of time, yet remains alive and proud. Bath, North Carolina, USA, is not flashy, but it is unforgettable. It teaches you that some stories are powerful not because they are loud or dramatic, but because they are real and lived every single day. 6 Weldon, North Carolina, USA. I arrived in Weldon, North Carolina, USA on a late afternoon, and the first thing that struck me was how quiet the town seemed compared to the stories I had heard. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, and the air carried a faint scent of the nearby Roanoke River, mixing with the history that seemed to seep from every corner. Walking through the town, I could feel the weight of decades, the echoes of a once thriving railway hub. Weldon had been a bustling center for trains, shipping goods and connecting communities across North Carolina. As I passed the old train station, now quiet and partially abandoned, I tried to imagine the clatter of locomotives, the shouts of conductors, and the crowds of workers and travelers. It was almost cinematic, the kind of image that feels unreal until you see the scars left behind by time. The old tracks still stretched along the river, overgrown in some parts, as if the land itself was reclaiming its space. I stopped by a small cafe on the corner, where a man in his 70s was cleaning tables. He had lived in Weldon his entire life and spoke with a mix of nostalgia and resignation. He told me about the glory days when trains came every hour and how the mills and small factories thrived. Families depended on them, children grew up hearing the whistle of engines as a comforting constant. But as the railway industry changed, the town slowly lost its heartbeat. Jobs disappeared, businesses closed, and younger generations left for cities that promised more opportunity. Walking further, I noticed homes in varying conditions. Some were well maintained, with freshly painted doors and neatly trimmed lawns. Others looked like they had been abandoned for years, windows boarded up, gardens overgrown. It was like the town itself was holding a memory of its past, a mixture of hope and loss. I could feel a quiet resilience in the air. Despite everything, people here stayed. They rebuilt, adapted, and found ways to live, even when it seemed like the world had moved on without them. By the riverbank, I watched the water reflect the fading sun, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. I could hear birds calling and feel the calm that Weldon still offered. Life here was slower, but it was present. The town's beauty was subtle, in the way neighbors still waved at each other, in the small shops that refused to close, and in the stories passed down by those who remembered better days. There was a certain dignity in that quiet persistence, a lesson about endurance and patience that city life rarely teaches. When I finally left Weldon, I realized that this town is not defined by its decline. Its story is about survival, memory, and the people who choose to stay despite challenges. Weldon, North Carolina, USA, teaches you that history is alive in quiet ways, in the buildings, the streets, and the hearts of those who remain. It is a town shaped by time, by change, and by the unwavering spirit of its residents, a story you feel long after you leave. 7 Roper, North Carolina, USA. I first drove into Roper, North Carolina, USA on a calm morning, and the town immediately felt different. There was no rush here, no hurried traffic or loud signs of progress. The streets were quiet, lined with small houses and old trees that bent slightly as if watching over the town. It felt personal, like Roper was sharing a secret with anyone willing to slow down and notice. Every step I took, I felt history wrapping around me gently, almost like the town itself was alive. Roper is small, and its size makes you feel close to everyone who lives here. I walked past homes where the morning light spilled onto porches, and I imagined the families who had lived there for generations. They spoke of a life tied to farming, fishing, and small local businesses. The river nearby shaped so much of their days, sometimes providing, sometimes threatening. When I stood near the water, I could almost hear the past whispering. Stories of harvests, storms, and the quiet determination of people who chose to stay despite the challenges. I met a man sitting outside a hardware store, sanding a piece of wood. His hands were rough from work, and his voice carried both pride and memory. He told me about how Roper had changed slowly over the years. Young people left for cities, industries closed, and the rhythm of life became softer. But even with all the change, he said the town held something that outsiders often miss, a connection to life itself. There's a patience here, a way of noticing details that big cities never let you see. It's a small town, but every life is visible, every story matters. Walking further, I saw the mixture of old and new. Some houses had been restored, glowing with care and love, while others showed signs of age, with paint peeling and gardens overgrown. Yet even the abandoned-looking places felt meaningful, like they held memories that refused to vanish. As I passed the small church near the town square, I heard the faint murmur of voices. Even in a quiet town, community endures in subtle ways. The kind of endurance that you feel in your chest rather than hear in noise. By late afternoon, the sun painted Roper in warm golden tones, and I stood near the river watching the reflections shimmer across the water. I realized something about small towns like this: they teach you how to see life beyond what's obvious. Roper may not appear on most maps as a center of attention, but it exists quietly, holding stories of survival, family, and resilience. Every smile I passed, every nod from a neighbor, felt like an unspoken acknowledgement of a shared past and present. Leaving Roper, North Carolina, USA, I carried a feeling that is hard to explain. This town is small, but it is alive in ways that matter. It doesn't need fame or crowds. Its story is about people who stay, who care, who live quietly and fully, even when the world outside changes too fast. Roper is real, human, and enduring, a town you feel long after you have gone.